If you're a senior marketer, I can guarantee you've been in a meeting or about to get into a meeting where some parts of the business, whether that's your founder, CEO, board of execs, or senior stakeholders, are going to start scrutinizing your output as a marketer. And having been in one of those rooms, you can easily start to doubt your value as a marketer, especially when you're wearing multiple hats. You're working on creating output across different marketing channels. What you'll find is that you'll usually get three types of personalities in these rooms. So the first one is the non-chalant. These are the people that don't even want to be in the room, but they're in the room for whatever reason. The second type of person is the inquisitive one. So these are the people who ask a lot of questions. Sometimes they ask questions for the sake of asking questions, and they generally want to extract value from marketing to benefit their program or their team. And then finally, you have the pessimist. This might be your chief financial officer. This might be a board of exec, or worse, the founder of the company. There is a silver lining with these things, though. It helps us marketers redirect output and rethink some of the approaches that we do have. I think in marketing, it's one of those fields where you can easily polarize yourself to focusing on output for the sake of output without understanding what the end goal is and how you're able to measure some of those aspects. You can easily get lost between the short-term and the long-term value of what you do. One day you might be focusing on profit and loss efficiency. The next you're managing people's sporadic emotions, and at the same time you're future planning for a future that might not even exist, assuming you still have the job. So rest assured, as mentioned, having been in one of these rooms, there's a lot of ways to reframe some of these questions. I call them accountability questions. And there are some low-hanging fruit ways of approaching some of these. And really the end goal is to communicate the value of marketing. So let's start with the first question. We're spending X amount on brand and upper funnel activity. Why can't we just put all that budget or focus into direct sales / customer acquisition / performance marketing? So this is a tough one, because when you're in these meetings, whether it's a quarterly KPI review meeting or a general month-on-month performance meeting, everyone in the room is going to focus on short-term results, when a lot of upper funnel activity like brand activity is more of a long-term play. So that's the first part of that. A brand campaign will not see its effect within a month. It can, but to even correlate the activation of a brand campaign to direct response in itself is another conundrum you'll have to face with. To make matters worse, and we'll talk more about this in a few seconds, brand activity, it's really almost impossible to have a deterministic way to attribute what it's done for the business beyond upper funnel metrics like reach, CPM, traffic, which in 2026, those are probably metrics that isn't as valuable as it was maybe 10, 15 years ago. When you spend £750,000 on a brand campaign, on an influencer marketing campaign, and you're not able to correlate the increase in revenue or customer acquisition, you're going to be in a very tough situation. But I've given you a clue already on how to approach this. So when we think of direct sales or direct response or customer acquisition, whichever term you want to use, that is a short-term play. When you talk about brand activity, content, upper funnel, output, it's always a long-term play, right? There's a re-engagement aspect, and there's also a way that brand marketing specifically shows its benefit in the long term, and there are ways to approach that as well. The problem with putting too much budget into acquisition is that acquisition is really just capturing the demand that you've already created. And remember, the algorithms are catered to show ad impressions dependent on signals. The forecasted number overall in terms of people with the intent to buy is actually only 3%, whereas the 97% are people who are either not in the intent of buying, or might not even be the customer that's right for your specific business. So knowing that if you oversaturate that 3%, your customer acquisition costs are going to increase automatically. And so the goal is for brand marketing to increase demand, not just in the short term, but long term, as mentioned. On the point regarding putting too much into performance marketing or advertising budget, focus on acquisition, is that once you saturate a certain demographic, whether that's in Meta ads or Google ads, because your cost per meals or your premiums are a lot more expensive, sometimes 10 to 15 times more than you would get on a brand awareness or traffic campaign, your customer acquisition cost initially might be cheap, but that will increase, and that will increase very quickly. And you'll notice if you've done retargeting campaigns where your audience pool is really small, right? You essentially oversaturate that audience when you've essentially saturated the aspect of the activity's incrementality, which is a whole other topic we can talk about in another video. So some other practical ways to go about this question is, once you've launched a brand campaign, whether that's on YouTube, connected TV, a metric that you can take a look at is brand demand, specifically search volume. You can use a tool like Google Keyword Planner. You can take a look at Google Trends, see those graphs increase, and which will likely happen if there's enough budget and demand created, or at least interest in the eyes of the people that do see the ad. And building on top of that, when you think of conversions driven by someone who already knows you, that customer acquisition cost is going to be a lot more efficient and a lot cheaper than someone who doesn't know you. That's why brand search based campaigns have way higher conversion rates and lower customer acquisition costs. All right, next question. Our customer acquisition cost is rising month on month. Why should we keep increasing or sustaining our spend on advertising at this level? So this question is a lot more easier to tackle as long as everyone in the room knows that advertising fundamentally is an auction-based business, i.e. that the prices are dictated by supply and demand, right? So simply put, if there are more advertisers, there's less ad inventory. When there's less ad inventory, again, your premiums or cost per meals will become more expensive, i.e. your CACs will then become more expensive. And you'll find this often depending upon the business that you're in, but there are seasonalities or there are certain periods in the year where it gets more expensive. Black Friday is an easy one. Christmas potentially. If you're in a business where you do sale there are sales or offers around spring or summer, you'll see that, when you have an offer, your competitors have an offer, that will hike up your CPMs. In other words, advertising is essentially competition. Generally, who pays more gets higher quality impressions. Very much in the same vein as inflation, we call CPM increases as media inflation. So knowing that should really solve 90% of the question. But if you want to understand the 10% lever that you may still need, keep watching. So when you have a stakeholder like a CFO who wants to cut budgets because, your metrics are, when I say metrics specifically, your customer acquisition cost, maybe profitability is decreasing, your role is really to defend your budget, right? Again, it's a lot of our role here is being able to justify what we do. And thankfully, because now we have data that we can qualify as a way to defend what we do, the first thing I would start speculating is your baselines. Not your industry benchmarks in terms of some of the metrics we'll talk about, but specifically baselines. So a baseline is an understanding of your average cost per mil, your average blended CAC, your paid CAC, ideally broken down by marketing channel or ad network, your direct and organic uplifts, and then finally, actually two more things, incremental reach and a sense of your customer lifetime value. So let's briefly go over these. So the first thing is understanding of your cost per mil, which is obviously how much you spend to get 1,000 impressions. As we mentioned already, this will automatically increase in more seasonal periods. just because you increase your advertising budget doesn't necessarily equate to you getting more customers, getting more revenue. That's not how advertising works. So if it's more expensive to show your ads to people, it's going to be more expensive to acquire that customer, right? If you do reduce your budget, you're cornering yourself into a trap. Next one is blended customer acquisition cost. So let's say your CAC increases from £50 to £75, which is a 50% increase, which can seem quite dire if you don't know how it's gotten to that point. But again, you don't want to approach it where you actively reduce your budget. It's about understanding. That's why we're talking about baselines right now. So the first step is actually understanding this increase in blended CAC. Is it a blended CAC, or is it coming from a specific channel, or is it directly coming from paid? And you'll find this often where your paid CAC actually does reduce, but your overall blended CAC increases. And the reason that happens is that because blended CAC is such a general KPI where it's taking into account organic and direct acquisitions, you might have an issue where there's just less conversion rates happening on a specific landing page. Or it might be that the website goes down for a couple of minutes when a lot of those customers would have gotten to the end conversion point, but weren't able to do. So there's all these factors that play into it when you think of the blended CAC. So the first step is to understand specifically where the drop-off is by channel. Another way you can tackle that is just looking at your brand demand and your category demand. Right. So again, we mentioned a tool like Google Keyword Planner or Google Trends. When I say category demand, that means the specific industry you're in. So an example is if you are a pet sitting company, you might look at obviously your branded terms. Category terms would be dog sitting companies near me or cat sitting in X city. Obviously, you want to take a look at how things are trending in terms of is it increasing or decreasing. So that's an easy way to justify the fact that even though you are advertising, that you might actually have lower performance. All right, next is paid CAC. So this one's a lot easier to navigate as well because the data's there. You can break it down by ad network. You can break it down by campaign, by ad set, ad group, keyword, or the specific ad. And you do find this a lot in specifically when you work at agency environments where they may look at the overall blended CAC, and if it increases, one of the first things they'll blame is paid, which is one of the friction points that I do face quite often. Yeah, first up is you don't panic. Again, as mentioned, you break it down by these parameters and you start to identify where the increase is actually coming from. And then you reverse it from that point on. So let's say if it's coming from a specific campaign on Meta, for example, understanding is that campaign specifically increasing CAC because of lower conversion rates? Is it an increase in CPM? Is it a reduction in traffic? Is it because the spend is allocating towards an ad that isn't performing quite well? So you start to get a bit more granular. And from a visual perspective, what happens is that senior marketers tend to look at metrics top down, whereas your paid media team will probably look at the data down top. So I think that you need a bit of team synergy in these situations. So next one is looking at your baseline direct and organic traffic and conversions. Again, you very likely use a tool like Google Analytics to help you prospect that data. But if you can see that if you've increased your spend and you're not getting an increased amount of new customers, it might be that the overall traffic is down. So that's traffic, especially new sessions or new user sessions, is still a valid metric. If you've recently increased your ad spend and you've seen that your paid volume of customers haven't actually increased, or maybe it's flatlined, it could be that your organic and direct channels are claiming those conversions, which happens a lot, more so on Google search. You'll see that happen often, especially if your business model is more in the B2C world where the click to sale customer journey is more than 28 days, right? If a person sees an ad on Meta, for example, but they don't convert within 28 days, they convert on day 29, Meta isn't going to claim that conversion. And very likely the direct or organic channel will actually claim it. The difficult thing is correlating that insight, and that's there is no software or way to approach that yet. That's why baselines is a way to create a bit of a moat around the increase in ad spend, but then you're not seeing an increase in acquisitions over in the advertising marketing channels versus organic and direct. So from a specific numbers point of view, for example, you get 1,000 customers via your direct channel, aka your website, and let's say it goes up to 1,500, so plus 50%. The following month, it's very likely that it's either maybe paid media has done this. It could be that you increased your budgets prior in a specific campaign that actually drives traffic. It could be that you increased your budget in your retargeting campaigns. Another variable could be that maybe for that specific month or as of recent, you changed your creative messaging, maybe something changed on the website. So again, the theme here is being able to identify things that have changed that can affect your baseline metrics and then starting to tie in a bit of a narrative. All right, so next one is incremental reach. So obviously reach is a unique ad impression. While it's difficult to correlate reach to acquisition, there are ways of going about it. And specifically, that's incremental reach. So incremental reach is an increase in the percentage of new users you can market to. So it's worth noting that when you saturate an audience already reached, you'll be paying a premium for it, aka increased CPMs. That's why you'll find that your retargeting campaigns actually have higher CPMs. So the more granular your targeting is, the more specific you are with who you want to market to, the more expensive it's going to be. So the value of incremental reach is basically you being able to understand a larger share of new potential customers that you've gained during that specific period of time. And a quick way you can do that is if your platform is able to give you reach, basically understand within a certain date period, let's say the last 2 weeks, what was our average reach for that specific campaign? And then as of this week, what is the total reach up to this point from including day one of that 14-day window, and subtract those numbers, and then whatever the hopefully increased reach that you see, that's your incremental reach. So closing off LTV, now it's a very difficult metric to identify, and as a marketer, in a way you almost have to create your own model of identifying this elusive metric. But if you do have the resource to have someone in your team get this metric for you, ideally broken down by channel, or at least an average blended LTV, specifically from customers that have come from a specific time period, that will be very useful. So basically, as long as your LTV to CAC ratio is still healthy, i.e. it's ideally above 3.1, you can justify the increase in your customer acquisition cost, right? So for example, if you have a cohort of customers gained in Q1 of 2027 and the average LTV is £300, and let's say your CAC has actually increased from 50 to 100, which is pretty dire, it's a 100% increase, it's doubled. You can justify that increase because A, you're still ROI positive, B, you very likely gained an X amount of new customers, and again, those new customers you've gained is an extra LTV for the business. And basically, to summarize, always think of ROI beyond the initial conversion point. All right, next question. Can you prove that this specific campaign led to this specific sale? So I just want to hone in on the fact that this video isn't about attribution. We can do a separate video on that. That's a big topic. But fundamentally, your business does need to understand how attribution works, and specifically how marketing channels claim a conversion. And unfortunately, if someone doesn't really understand attribution, it's like you explaining rocket science to a 5-year-old who isn't interested. You can explain it, but they still won't get it. A lot of what we do as marketers is educating the people around us. Really important points about attribution. First one is it isn't a deterministic portrayal of the truth, right? It's only a narrative, and you can quote me on that. Next is attribution isn't linear. And if you think of the customer's journey from touch point all the way to the point of deciding to buy from us, that is a very long and complex journey. There's a lot of variables that we won't be able to see even in 2026. Unless there comes a point where companies start installing chips in our brains and that becomes a way to track our decision making, then attribution will be a bit more deterministic. But for now, thankfully, we're not there yet. And then finally, every marketing channel, specifically ad networks, has its own modeling technology, attribution window, and attribution type, whether that's last click, first click, linear, time decayed, or very likely data driven. And so knowing all these variables, going back to the first one, attribution, it's just a narrative. Right? Don't believe that's the pure truth. It's just more of a narrative of what the truth could be. Next question. If we cut your budget by 20% tomorrow, what would actually happen to revenue or customer acquisition? So this is probably one of the more sillier questions you'll get, but very likely you may get it. So knowing that marketing, it's really a long-term capital investment, so you want to tell your CFO that, and marketing isn't purely just a variable or cost expense for the business. There is an ROI. What's tricky about this question is that marketing's impact is cumulative over time. It's not as if you launch a campaign, you post on social media or you post a blog, that within that instant you will see the ROI. That's just not how it works. It could be that your past campaigns are actually projecting its value a couple of months down the line in the future. And you start doubting the value of that specific campaign, whether that was a couple of months or maybe years ago. And so even if you did reduce your budget because you're trying to be more efficient, you won't even see the detrimental effect of that until a couple of months. Remember, advertising is competition. Advertising is war. So you trying to be more efficient, may you just be cornering yourself or making it more difficult for the future position that your business will be in. And we've seen this with On, the shoe brand. If I remember correctly, around the pandemic, Nike and Adidas decided to reduce their paid search budgets, trying to be more efficient. We don't know the true reasoning behind it. And strategically, On's paid media team went aggressive with Google search and dominated the impression share. And the last time that I was personally looking for a shoe to buy, they were essentially always at the top of the page from an impression share point of view. So that's just one example. I'm sure there's a lot more case studies. The annoying thing is that anomalies can happen where I've experienced this personally, where I would decrease paid media budget and actually see organic and direct conversions increase, and vice versa, where I increase paid media budgets, but then see direct and organic channels decrease in demand. It happens more often than not. So the best way to go about this question is basically just to reframe it. What do we deem as being efficient? What does that actually look like? What does efficiency look like, but practically? Like from a KPI point of view, what does efficient look like? Why are we even thinking of being efficient? It's about questioning the question in the first place. And then if we did reduce marketing budget or ad spend, what's the long-term or hidden costs that we'll have to face or that we could be sacrificing? So each of those questions, in many ways, it's a dissertation, but hopefully it will help you and the wider team just rethink cutting marketing budget because you're trying to be efficient. All right, next question. Why are we spending so much on content and social media marketing when we can't even track its ROI for the business? Kind of building on top of some of the previous points we've spoken about already. Content marketing, which I would say it's much more of an upper funnel play, is hard to correlate to acquisition. We already know that fact. So we're going to move on and starting to speculate how to answer this question beyond that. You think of content and social media as a sales enabler. It's not the point of sales, right? It helps support the decision-making of wanting to buy the product. The decision is always with the customer. So assuming you're already doing content marketing, this really is about being able to identify the value of content marketing, whether that's social media posts, PR, blog. We've already discussed that the customer journey from point of awareness or point of click all the way to a conversion is not linear, and they will go through many touch points. This is not for every customer that you're going to have, but a good portion of your customers would have gone through your content before becoming a customer. It's very likely you're going to start hearing a term called dark social. So what that really means is it's basically invisible shares and conversations that your customers and prospects have in private channels. These are conversations in private channels you can't actually track. So hence it's dark because you can't see it. So your web, your app, or your product analysis tool won't be able to track even traffic for these. These conversations will likely happen in WhatsApp, Slack, social media platforms, and maybe content outside of your owned website, so external websites. An example could be LinkedIn. You put a thought leadership piece, you can't necessarily track the traffic. There are ways of going about it, but that's not the point of this video. Basically, put content engagement, whether it's a like, a view, or a share. It's very difficult to correlate that to acquisition, but it is an engagement. And as mentioned, engagement is a touch point that a customer will go through before deciding to buy a product, especially when a customer or a prospect is in the research phase of the buying decision process. It's very likely that they'll take a look at some of these channels and engage with other people and discuss it. That's what happens in the digital world. And if we translate that over to the offline world, we just call that word of mouth, right? I bought something because someone recommended this product. This doesn't necessarily mean that I bought the product because I saw an ad on a TV. But for you as a marketer to understand that, it's basically impossible. So that basically dark social, it's a type of engagement that you're not able to see. There is a halo effect of content, especially when it's another person engaging with another person. Other people's influence on our decision-making, thinking process is very high. So closing off, final question. Our competitor is doing X, Y, Z. Shouldn't we do the same tactic or approach? This question is one of the trickier ones to navigate because it is valid. There is a lot of value. Marketing is a battlefield, and you missing out on the latest tactics or strategies or new channels that you should be trying to speculate could be harmful for the business, and it can make you and your team look bad. Generally, you'd be in two situations. One is that you just weren't aware of what your competitors are doing. Or second, ideally, you're not seeing your competitors' output as the right thing to do, or you don't see it as valuable, specifically for your use case. And I guess if you have someone asking this, it's very likely they have the fear of missing out syndrome, which is they read an article about the business that you're in and that specific competitor has done A, B, C, or they've seen a post somewhere, or they know someone that knows the ins and outs of that specific business. And unfortunately, the marketing function is an easy team to put that blame on, because on paper, they think that the marketing team should be on the pulse of everything that's happening within the online world, when in actuality, that should be an understanding of your competitor should be a business-wide agenda. There's a couple of ways to tackle this question. Here are some of those levers. So the first one is the differentiation argument. So if it was so easy to build and grow a business, why don't we all just copy each other, right? The fact is, marketing is a way to position and differentiate, right? You want to project the fact that your business is different and it's better than your competitors, or better for a specific type of customer. So that extends on to the fact that your tactic and strategies will not be the same as competitor ABC. If you have a specific output that's working for you, triple down on it. You don't have to fragment your output because your competitor is doing a specific thing or a new thing that you're not doing. Second is the first mover advantage versus latecomer tax. If you're blindsided by a competitor's output, I would first explain the risks of trying to copy the competitors. One of the ways is that it could be that your competitor already grabbed a good portion of potential customers from that specific output or tactic, and you copying that approach may cost you a latecomer tax, whether that's increased CPMs, lower conversion rates, or potentially in advertising showing an offer that a customer has already grabbed weeks or months prior because your competitor's already done it. And that would dictate you getting higher customer acquisition costs when you could have just done a new initiative as opposed to just copying your competitor. Another thing, you could say that you were delaying the decision of copying your competitor because you were trying to figure out a different approach, or maybe trying to figure out a new undervalued channel. Next one is very much so in the practical terms. which is basically resourcing or the internal capability problem. This one's an easy mode to utilize because practically speaking, it might be that even if there was a specific initiative that your competitor has done, you might not have the internal resource to actually even deploy that. So an example of that could be, let's say your competitor has thought leaders who are good at content marketing, and then they have in-house creative teams that can help them make sure that content looks great. Let's say on LinkedIn, for example, end-to-end, whereas in your case, there may not be a thought leader, or if there was one, they don't create content, or you might not have the resource to get the content out within the moment that specific news needs to be shared with on social media. So that's just one use case. I think just the caveat with that is make sure that it doesn't sound as an excuse, but on a practical level, it could be that you're not able to deploy specific output as a marketer because you don't have the resource. And that happens more often than not as well. Hence, I've added it as a point. And then a final one here is vanity versus sanity syndrome. So just because your competitor is doing a specific marketing output doesn't necessarily mean it's working, right? First up, you're not even able to see the performance of that specific output. So this goes back to focusing on the 3% of output that actually brings you 97% of the results that you do get. So it's about, relating to the previous point, doubling down or tripling down on what's working. Or maybe you can find a way to change the approach within that 3% that actually works for you, rather than spending your time and energy into copying your competitor. Especially in marketing, we are already wearing multiple hats. We're very fragmented in what we do. Being able to focus on what's working is a goldmine. Thank you for watching the video. Until next time, peace.